Hello, and welcome to the recording of the From Source to Sink Groundwater Series presentation. I'm Rachel Marks, and I'm the Watershed Specialist for Pike County Conservation District, and I will be going through the presentation today. To get started, the contents of the presentation are on the screen, so we're going to go through who we are as Pike County Conservation District and who I am. We're going to look at where your water comes from and how it works. We're going to talk about protecting yourself and your water source, and then we're going to go over some water testing information. Pike County Conservation District is an organization through the County of Pike, and we are committed to the long-term protection and the use of Pike County's natural resources in a sustainable way. And we do that through partnering with other local organizations, education, outreach, technical assistance with landowners, and more. What is a conservation district? So we are part of the Pike County government, as I mentioned, and we were established by the Pike County Commissioners in 1956. This was made possible through a Pennsylvania law, Act 217, which established Pennsylvania's conservation districts as a whole. We are a legal subdivision of the state and local government. And again, our focus is on soil, water, and other resource conservation, as well as other critical issues that come up, such as invasive species and so on. What I do as the watershed specialist is a little bit different than some of the other staff here at Pike Conservation District. I do some groundwater monitoring throughout Pike County in partnership with the United States Geological Survey. And I also do some surface water monitoring. In our case, that means monitoring of the streams in Pike County. And Pike County Conservation District has a long-standing program doing so, where we look at the life in the stream as well as some of the chemistry to determine the overall health. We also do education and outreach, so I do programs such as this one. We go to schools and we do some off-site programs as well. And I also do some landowner assistance, so helping people find information on their water and on invasive species and other questions that they may have. So first thing out off the bat here is, where does your drinking water come from? So a lot of people turn on their tap and water comes out, but where does that water come from? And for Pike County, that is the ground, or as we refer to it as groundwater. And Pike County is 100% dependent on groundwater for our daily water needs. So anytime that we are turning on a faucet, flushing a toilet, turning on a hose, that water is going to be coming from the ground. And even though we do have some larger communities like Milford and Matamoras and a lot of developments within the county, that development and that area still uses water that comes from the ground for the source of their drinking water and household water use. So I've said groundwater a couple times, but what is groundwater? So groundwater is, most simply put, water that is underground. And that may seem a little broad, but groundwater is really water within the pores of some rock underground. So you'll see in this diagram here how we have taken a cross section of the earth. So on top we have the soil. Underneath that is some dry rocks or unsaturated, which means it does not have any water in it. And then below it we have saturated rock, which means there's water in between the pores. And you can see in this close-up here how there are small particles of rock, and some have water between them and others don't. So that's just the difference between the unsaturated and the saturated rock. And that layer, or that boundary between the unsaturated and the saturated rock, is what we call the water table. So that's just where the water sits underground. I've heard a lot of references to people imagining groundwater as something like an underground river, but that's not the case. It's just water that's in between these pores in the ground. So though our groundwater is out of sight, as I mentioned, it's below the soil. We don't really see it. That doesn't mean that it's safe from our human activities, right? So when we have some action above the surface, that can sometimes impact what goes on below the surface. And Pennsylvania, the state, does not regulate private well water quality. So meaning that any quality of the drinking water at your private residence, if you have your own well, is up to you, the landowner or the well owner. The state does not have any regulation as to the quality, and there's no enforcement regarding that. So again, it's up to the owners to just maintain and protect their well, which may seem like a lot, but there's a lot of small things that we can do to help protect ourselves and our drinking water. And it's important to know, as I had mentioned, that this water is underground between these rock particles. And so some of the issues that we're going to talk about can be naturally occurring. So there are different things mixed in with the rocks, for example, iron and things like that. And they can kind of get into the water as it's moving underground. So typically, when we talk about groundwater and the use of groundwater, it goes hand in hand with a well. So wells are what we use to get water out from the ground, and they can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. So we can see here these two photos and a couple extra. Just the variety in the way that a well can appear, depending on who drilled it, the timing of the drilling, and so on. So it's just important to know, first and foremost, where your well might be on your property. Sometimes it's not always that easy to see, but it's just important to know as a starting point where it is on your property and just be aware of the area surrounding it as well. So as I mentioned, we rely on wells to help get our groundwater up out of the ground and into our homes. So we'll just walk through briefly the structure of a well. So a well is something that is drilled into the ground. So it's basically just a hole in the ground, and it taps into that aquifer or that water table. So the aquifer is just an area of saturated rock like we saw earlier. And you can see here in this photo that this well casing is drilled down through those layers of rock into the aquifer. And then inside of that, there's a submersible pump. So that pump goes into the water, and when you turn on your faucet, it pumps water up out from under the ground and into your house. And you can see the pressure tank and the power and the pressure switch inside the house here. And that's just a small holding tank that can store some water that has already been pumped up out of the ground. And then the parts that we saw in the previous slides of the appearance above ground is just that small part of well casing and the wellhead and cap that stick up out of the ground. So the way that wells work, like I said, there is a submersible pump, and it goes down below the water level to help pump water up out of the well and into your home or wherever you're using it. When the water is not being used, it returns to what we call a static water level, or just a steady level of water where nothing is being used, nothing is changing. That's where the water table currently is. Then when the well is pumped, if you run your faucet and the pump needs to run to get more water out of the ground, you'll see this drawdown or this cone of depression, which means water is getting sucked up into the well and water from surrounding areas is filtering back in to fill that space. And it flows in from surrounding rock back to that central point or your well, the spot where you're pumping. One of the major concepts along with how wells work and groundwater is source water protection. So source water protection is, simply put, the idea of protecting the source of your water supply. So in our case, protecting our source of water would be protecting our groundwater. And source water protection has to deal with determining potential sources of contamination to that water source. So we would be, in our case, looking at potential sources of contamination or things that can get into our groundwater. And again, I had mentioned earlier that though the water is underground and it is out of sight, we can still have effects on that water. So we want to make sure that we're being aware of that. And then again, one of the things that I like to talk about in the environmental field as a whole, but very specifically as well in the drinking water field, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So we want to make sure that we are focusing on prevention and not reaction. Prevention in the environmental field, as well as in a lot of different areas of life, is often very much more cost effective than reacting to a situation. And the Department of Environmental Protection does offer a program that helps larger communities in our area and across the state of Pennsylvania develop source water protection plans for a community as a whole. And we'll get a little bit more into different source water practices that you can use on a smaller scale in your own backyard, but if you do live in a community, it's good to look into that as an option as well. It's important to mention here as well that we mentioned how the water is underground in these aquifers, but not quite how it gets there. So to start off, there are two different types of surfaces that we commonly mention. The first is an impervious surface, and those are things such as parking lots, roofs, anything that doesn't allow water to go through it. And you can see in this diagram here on the left, it says runoff. So these surfaces often create a runoff situation. So for example, a parking lot where the water is running across the lot and eventually reaching an endpoint. And with that, it can pick up contaminants such as, for this time of year as it is February, rock salts and a variety of other things like fluids from vehicles and so on. The opposite of that is what we would call a pervious surface. So these are natural areas that allow water to percolate through them and really have a very limited amount of runoff created. So these are areas, as you can see in the diagram, like grassy areas, forests, and lawns, anything like that, something that will allow water to percolate through. And that's how a lot of the groundwater ends up getting back into the ground. So eventually those droplets will percolate down into the water table and recharge our groundwater. One of the key parts of source water protection is being aware of your watershed. So the watershed is simply an area where all of the runoff is going to drain to a central point. So you'll see here there's a stream. So a lot of that agricultural runoff is shedding down into the stream, and that would be the watershed of the stream. And it's important just to be aware of things going on in your watershed. So a watershed could be very small, just your immediate property, but it also goes out larger and larger and larger to the whole county of Pike, and Pike County is within the Delaware River watershed, and it goes to the ocean and so on. So first and foremost, like this diagram shows, just being aware of things, activities that might be going on in your watershed. So things like agriculture or things like water treatment facilities, industrial areas, developed areas, those can introduce potential new sources of contamination to the groundwater that you want to just keep an eye out on. These things help you realize potential risks and give you an idea of things to look for as you're going and you're testing your water. Along with source water protection, we'll talk about the zones of protection. So this is an overview or an aerial view down onto a property. And a lot of the time when we talk about source water protection, we talk about zones, like I said. So we have zone 1, which is the most sensitive zone. And this is the one that is the most important for a single well, private well owner. So if you have a well on your property, you really want to be cognizant of that 100-foot radius, if you can, around your well. That's the most sensitive area. If there were to be some sort of contamination, it would be one of the most immediate things to show up in your water test. Zone 2, this green circle here, or shape, is a little bit further out, and that's about a half-mile radius. That is less immediate and about a 10-year time of travel. So if something were to happen in that zone, depending on where it is, you'll have some time to react. And that's why it's important to just pay attention to those areas, because though it won't happen tomorrow, there's something to look out for. And then zone 3 is just the remainder of the watershed. So you can see this blue shape here. And these are dependent upon topography and geology. So that's why these shapes are not perfectly round, right? So if there's a large hill, that's going to affect how much water is coming down or going elsewhere, and so on. And again, that 100-foot radius is the most important. So think of that about the space of a basketball court around your well. So you just want to make sure that we're minimizing the impact to that area. And this is just another diagram, but it's more of a slice of the earth when we're looking, or like a side view of those source water protection zones. So again, you'll see zone 1 is right immediately near the well. And again, that's the most sensitive area. And then you see zone 2, which is that yellow highlighted space, and then zone 3, which is that further out view. So we've talked a lot about the zones of protection and contaminants and things like that. And now we're getting to the point where maybe that's a lot of information that might seem a bit scary, but what can you do as a well owner, right? So one of the most important things that you can do as a private well owner is getting your water tested. And it's recommended to do that every 12 to 14 months. I think annually is a good way to remember it, just to have an annual reminder and just make sure that we're keeping up on getting our water tested in case anything changes. Definitely when you are getting your water tested, you want to make sure you're using a Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, certified lab. So that's a lab that has been rigorously tested by the state to use the methods and be accurate with their testing. Again, you also want to be looking at your well, and make sure you look at your well cap. There are 2 different types of well caps. One just kind of sits on top and does protect things from falling inside the well. But if you notice there are some gaps in the side, you might want to consider switching to a sanitary well cap. So a sanitary well cap just has a little bit more of a sealer around it, which helps prevent things from crawling up and under into your well. So things like snakes, spiders, anything like that will be prevented from getting into your well if you have that extra rubber gasket or seal around your well. And one more thing that you can do is gathering your well records. So that's important because the more information, the better. But those well records can help you make a schedule for maintenance, look for things to look out for, and it could also help if you do get your water tested and you have some well records, just notice any changes that might be occurring. So if you have a water test from 10 years ago and now all of a sudden there's a super high iron, maybe it is a cause for investigation just to figure out maybe what's going on there. If you don't have any well records, you can try to consult a well driller. So Well drillers can sometimes take a look at your well and investigate it, even if they aren't the person that originally drilled it, and give you some information about the depth and so on. You can also go online to the Pennsylvania Groundwater Information System website, and that's a spot where some of the more recently drilled wells will have the records available for things like the depth and so on. So it's just good to keep in mind some options for gathering more information about your well and the maintenance that might be coming up or anything to look out for, really. So why test your water if it tastes fine, right? So if you pour yourself a glass of water from your house and it tastes fine and it looks fine, why test it? Well, a lot of contaminants to our groundwater supplies don't have any taste or odor. So, for example, things like bacteria that can cause some gastrointestinal issues, they don't really have a taste and you can't really smell them in the water. And other things that are more chemical, so things like nitrates or the pH, which is just the acidity of the water, can't really be detected through taste. And then some of the issues that could be present in your water may not be anything that causes any health problems, but things that can cause infrastructure issues. So, like I had mentioned on the previous slide, having something like a high iron or a very uh, high calcium in your water can cause some infrastructure problems. So, iron starting to build up in your pipes or calcium starting to build up in your sink and in your faucet, things like that. So it's just good to know what to look out for. And when you get your water tested by a Pennsylvania DEP certified lab, it will be compared to established drinking water standards. So, though Pennsylvania does not regulate the quality of private wells within the state, there are state drinking water standards, and those are usually enforced on public water supplies, so things like apartment buildings and schools. And those are based on the Department of or the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, their standards, which they have established nationwide. So when you do get your water tested, it will be compared to those drinking water standards, so you know where you fall in the spectrum of health concern or not, or if you have a high iron or a low iron, it'll help you figure out where you stand. And again, some contaminants can cause health issues, and we'll get a little bit more into that in the next slide as well. So, as I had mentioned, some parameters can cause health problems, others just more on the infrastructure and things like that. So, a primary contaminant is one that can cause a health problem. And again, that's mainly in this case the bacteria presence or absence, but it could also be things like lead and nitrates. Um, and then the secondary contaminants are none that will cause really many health issues, but can cause aesthetic issues or taste problems. So things like iron and hardness. If you have a very high salinity, you can start to taste that, things like of that nature. And that's just like the main division there between the different types of contaminants. And those should be identified for you if you get your water tested and you get a test back. And again, this may seem a bit scary, but there are ways to treat all of these issues. And we won't really get into that today, but Penn State Extension and some other resources online have a variety of ways that you can treat some of these issues. There are options. So, for example, on this slide, you'll see on the right-hand side a reverse osmosis system. So that is a system that can take out a lot of contaminants. But there are other things depending on the issue that you're facing, such as a whole house filter or something like that, that can help just get rid of some of the larger particles or some less serious issues. So as a part of this program, we'll just look at one of the test kits available. So one of our partners, Penn State Extension, does offer water test kits to the public. And you can go to any Penn State Extension office and go ask for one and pick one up. And they are free to pick up. The only thing you have to pay for is the testing or the analysis that you want done to that water sample. And they come with very specific instructions that you'll want to follow to a T and exactly as written. So that is one option. There are other options. There are private companies that go around in the state of Pennsylvania, and they will test the water for you or give you the resources to submit your own sample. And it's very important, again, that you use a lab that has been certified by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So that they do have a list that is available online, and if you would like that list, please reach out to us, or you can find it yourself online. And I would recommend using that list if you are going to look for a private company or any company to do your water testing. So this is just an example of the test options from the Penn State Extension Ag Analytical Services Lab. And this is just some of the tests that you might have the option to get done on your water sample. So again, we mentioned that total coliform bacteria and that E. coli, those are the bacteria that can cause some gastrointestinal discomfort, potentially illness and stuff like that. So that would be a primary parameter that you want to get tested for. And then there are some other things that are secondary or more aesthetic and infrastructural, and that would be the pH and the total dissolved solids. But it's a very good basic standard water test. And this is just an example of what the results might look like. So again, you'll have what test was done, your result, and then it will compare it to the established standard. So you'll be able to tell if your pH is out of the normal range or any of these other parameters that your water may have been tested for. On a larger scale, there are also a lot of other things that we can do in our communities for ourselves and for our groundwater source as a whole. So one of the most important things that I can't recommend enough is just making sure your septic system is being maintained. So if you don't know where your septic system is, that's okay. Just try to identify where that is. You can call a company to come and identify where it is and do an assessment on how it's functioning. In general, you want to make sure that you're getting your septic system pumped every 3 to 5 years. And that can really depend on if it's a seasonal home or a full-time home, how many people are in the home, and a variety of other factors. So definitely just be cognizant of that maintenance on that system. If a septic is not functioning properly, it could potentially lead to some groundwater contamination, as we saw in our diagram earlier in the presentation. Another thing you can do is just be conservation minded. So conserve your water, use your water responsibly to maintain the water quantity. And that's another part of source water protection that I didn't mention earlier, is that we're looking at the quality of the water, but also the quantity. One of the ways that I like to envision source water protection and the quantity of water is that as we drill more wells into the same aquifer, it's almost like putting more straws into the same glass of water. So we just want to make sure that we are just using as much as we need and allowing other people to use that water as well, and also allowing for more water to re-enter back into the system. You also want to think about disposing of your household hazardous waste properly. So those are things such as paints, cleaning products, oils, any kind of chemical, anything of that nature. And that could also include any types of fertilizers and those types of chemicals as well. But you just want to make sure that if you do need to buy any of those products, you buy only what you think you might need. If you do end up having extra, don't just throw it in the trash. Make sure you're disposing of it properly and always follow the instructions on the label. And one final thing that we can do that I'm highlighting on this slide is planting native species. So native species are good for a variety of reasons, but in this case, they're really great because native species, or species that are native to our area, are really well adapted to our area's conditions. So that means that if our soil tends to have less nitrogen, they're used to that and they can handle those low nitrogen situations and so on. So in general, a native plant species needs less fertilizers, less maintenance, and so on. So it's just easier overall, but then it requires less of those chemicals and that other maintenance. And there are other best management practices that we can use around our properties as well. So this is a diagram from our website or the Watershed Friendly Home brochure that we have. And it just highlights some of the things that I mentioned on the previous slide and then some other options as well, just to be conservation minded as we go through our lives and as we manage and interact with our property. So for example, the maintaining of green spaces on our property and just being cognizant of when we are going to develop our properties or do something like put up a garage, that we're being mindful of where that water is going and making sure that we maintain enough green space or that pervious ground to allow water to recharge back into the ground. There's also things that are a little easier, like cleaning up after your pet, making sure you're using road salt appropriately, and just maintaining your car so that fluids aren't leaking out, things like that. So in summary, Pike County depends on groundwater. So even if you don't live in Pike County full time, if you are in Pike County and you turn on a faucet, you're dependent on groundwater. And again, just because our groundwater might not be visible to us, it can still be influenced by above ground activity. So we want to also make sure that we are aware of on the surface activity in our watershed and around our properties. Please, if you don't already get your water tested regularly, please look into getting your water tested. If you need additional resources, please reach out to us. And at the end of the day, one of the most important reminders is just that though there are a lot of different things that we're talking about here today and contaminants and stuff, there are things that we can do to make a difference, and there are ways to treat these problems, but we can't treat these problems if we don't know that they're there. So again, get your water tested, and again, there are ways that we can make a difference. So please, if you do have any questions, reach out to us. Our email and our website are here, and our phone number. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thanks.